Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. You might have noticed that I recently changed the name of this channel to Holy Hype. Before it was just my name, but I decided to create a podcast where some of these videos are going to be uploaded to podcast platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts. I haven't decided yet if I'm gonna put my Mark series on there. Please let me know what you think, if you think that these videos should also be on my podcast platform. I'm not sure about that yet. So far, that channel is more topical. Not the channel. The podcasts are more topical. But it's all from the videos on this channel. I'm just also uploading them as podcasts in case you guys want to listen to them. So let me know what you think, if I should put Mark on there as well. But today we're going to be doing Mark chapter 8, which is such a good chapter. I was studying it and making my notes, and I just found so many interesting tidbits I want to share with you guys. If you're brand new here, I'm Stav, and my goal here is to get you hyped up and excited about the Bible and the way of Jesus, because I've come to realize, even though I've been learning about this stuff my whole life, I've come to realize in the last few years that it's actually the most interesting and amazing book in the entire world. And it's life-changing. So I want you guys to be as excited as I am about it. So we're gonna dive into Mark chapter 8, and I'm just gonna read a chunk of it. I'm gonna read verses 1 through 10 first, and then we'll discuss it, and then we'll go on all the way to the end of Mark. So let's start in verse 1. In those days, when again a great crowd had gathered, and they had nothing to eat, he called his disciples to him and said to them, I have compassion on the crowd because they've been with me now these 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way. And some of them have come from far away. And his disciples answered him, How can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place? And he asked them, How many loaves do you have? They said, 7. And he directed the crowd to sit down on the ground. And he took the 7 loaves, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And they set them before the crowd. And they had a few small fish. And having blessed them, he said that these also should be set before them. And they ate and were satisfied. And they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. And there were about 4,000 people. And he sent them away. And immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha. All right, that's verses 1 through 10. So going back to verse 1, the first story we have here is when Jesus feeds the 4,000. And back in chapter 6, we saw that Jesus fed the 5,000. So as I was reading this, I was wondering, Mark and Matthew are the only ones who include the feeding of the 4,000 in their accounts. But the feeding of the 5,000 is in all 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so I was wondering, why did Mark and Matthew choose to include the feeding of the 4,000? And as I researched it, I learned that the feeding of the 5,000 was mostly to the Jewish people. Those were mostly Jewish people at that event. But the feeding of the 4,000 was likely more Gentiles. And so if you dive into that, there are a lot of interesting theories about the number of the bread and the number of the fish in correlation to the Gentiles and the Israelites. So that can be really interesting to dive into, but without going too deep into it, I just think it's important to note here that Jesus came to minister to both the Jews and then also to the Gentiles. So I think that's the big takeaway from this. And also we see here in verse 2, it says, I have compassion on the crowd. We see over and over Jesus has compassion on people, and that's ultimately why God became a person. He came in human form to us because he has compassion on us and wants to show mercy to us in the grander scheme of things. But we see him display this compassion over and over as he deals with people here on earth. So just for your notes, the parallel passage in Matthew to the feeding of the 4,000 is Matthew 15 verses 32 to 39, if you want to go and read that as well, just to see how the two accounts compare. So here they've got the 7 loaves, and he takes the 7 loaves and he gives thanks. And growing up, we always prayed over our meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. We always gave thanks to God. And I've stopped doing that in my adult life. And reading this, I just see over and over Jesus gives thanks every time he's gonna eat or feed people. He gives thanks, and I think that's an important thing that I should start doing again, because food is a gift. It's a gift from God. Many people are hungry right now, and if I have food, I should be thankful for that. So I think I'm going to start implementing that again. I think I just kind of got away from it after I left my childhood home, but I'd like to get back into that. So I know a lot of people give thanks before eating a meal, and sometimes if I'm with like my whole extended family, we do that, but I think I need to start doing that just as a sign of gratitude to the Lord. Not because it's a rule, because Jesus never says you have to pray before every meal. He doesn't say that. But the example that we see from him is this gratitude for the food. So that's just a little takeaway for me personally. So then he feeds the 4,000. Those were only 4,000 men. There were also probably women and children, so it's a little more than that. But then there are left over 7 baskets full of food, and these were big baskets, so that's a lot of food. And we see every time Jesus feeds the 5,000, Jesus feeds the 4,000, there's always leftovers. And so then he gets in the boat with his disciples and leaves. All right, so now we're on verse 11. We're going to read, this section is 11 through 21, and this one's a doozy, so stick around. The Pharisees came and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, "Why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation." And he left them, got into the boat again, and went to the other side. Okay, hold on, we're gonna stop there. So it's 11 through 13 is its own little section. So here we see the Pharisees once again are hounding Jesus, and they want a sign, and it says in verse 11, to test him. And the verse that came to mind here when I read this verse is Deuteronomy 6:16, which says, "You shall not put the Lord your God to the test." So they're trying to test him and say, like, prove that you are who you say you are. They want all these signs. Even though they've seen him heal people and cast demons out of people, they've seen him do all of these things. And so in verse 12, when we see him sigh deeply in his spirit, it's because he's probably frustrated at their hardness of heart. And he says, "Why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation." Because Jesus knows that these Pharisees who've been studying the books of Moses, and they know all of the prophecies that Jesus is fulfilling right in front of their eyes, they're so hard-hearted that they can't even see what's happening right in front of them is the fulfillment of all these things they've been learning about their whole lives. So he's frustrated. And I think many people who are not believers wish that God would just show up in front of them and give them a sign or tell them, "Hey, it's me, I'm real." But he has given us so much proof. If you don't believe, the problem is probably in here. It's not that God is not showing himself to you, it's that your heart is so hardened and your eyes are not open and you can't see it. So check your hearts, because there's plenty of proof. And in a few verses, I'm gonna share this little interesting fact about the prophecies he fulfilled, but we'll move on here. So here in the parallel Matthew passage, Jesus says something really interesting. So I'm going to read that part to you. It's Matthew 12, verses 38 to 41. "Then some of the scribes and Pharisees answered him, saying, 'Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you.'" So this is Matthew's recording this same event that Mark was just recording. "But he answered them, 'An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The men of Nineveh will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and behold, something greater than Jonah is here.'" This just blows my mind. So if you've ever heard the story of Jonah, I think it's one of those like childhood Bible stories that a lot of kids hear, where Jonah is swallowed by the fish and he's in there for 3 days and 3 nights. Jonah happened a little over 800 years before Jesus is speaking these words and before Jesus is crucified. And he's saying, that Jonah is like a foretelling of what's going to happen to Christ. Just like Jonah was in the belly of the fish, Jesus is going to die and then 3 days later be resurrected. And that just blows my mind. And just so you guys know, I created a Patreon page for Holy Hype, and every month we're going to be doing like a Zoom call together. And it's just a little way for you guys to help support Holy Hype. A few dollars a month will give you a Patreon membership to our community, and we have a chat going and all that. But we're going to be studying the book of Jonah at the end of June. We're going to have a Zoom call where we study the whole book. It's only 4 chapters, but there's so much to talk about there. But if you're interested in learning more about Jonah, definitely join us for that, because it's going to be really, really cool. But I just think this is so amazing, because Jesus is saying the only sign that you're going to get from me is that I'm going to die and be resurrected 3 days later. And what does he do? He does it. Jesus knows the state of the Pharisees' hearts, and even though he's performing all these signs and miracles in front of their eyes, they can't accept it. They won't accept it. And so he's saying, your last chance is going to be when I die and am resurrected 3 days later. Just like Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Oh, it's just so amazing, because Jonah was written 800 plus years before he's speaking these words, and now he's using that story as a parallel to what's going to happen to him. It's just so cool. If you read the whole Bible, you can't tell me that it's not inspired by God, because a person could not have put this together. It's impossible. All right, so let's move on to verse 14, because I could talk about Jonah for forever. So 14 through 21. Now they had forgotten to bring bread, and they had only 1 loaf with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? They said to him, 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? And they said to him, 7. And he said to them, do you not yet understand? So here he's in the boat with the disciples, and they're talking about bread. And Jesus uses this moment to discuss the Pharisees and to caution them against what he calls the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. The thing that the Pharisees and Herod had in common is their unbelief in Jesus and their hardened hearts. So leaven is what goes into bread that causes it to grow and rise. I've been making sourdough a lot. You might have watched the beginning of my sourdough journey where I mentioned that I really wanted to learn how to make it, and I've been making it a lot. So I see the yeast, the natural yeast that's inside sourdough bread, causes it to double as it rests. And so Jesus is talking here about leaven, which is what you put into dough to cause it to grow. And he's saying the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod, you gotta watch out for that. Meaning the things that these people are spreading and their way of life can lead to ultimate destructive growth. So he's just warning them against that. But they seem to totally miss the point, and they're talking about actual bread. So Jesus says, why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? So they totally miss the point. Now he's saying, don't you remember when I fed the 5,000 and then the 4,000? And then he says, do you not yet understand? So Jesus is hanging out with these people constantly. They're seeing him do these miracles, they're listening to him teach, and they still don't get it. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that he came in such a revolutionary way that they were not expecting, because everyone at that time was expecting the Messiah to be this like big political military leader, and Jesus comes and he's this perfect example, and just he's God's character in human form, and I don't think they expected that. So they're just totally missing the point here, and they don't understand what he's talking about. But it is a good example to us. It's like one bad apple can spoil the whole bunch. Is that the saying? So You have to be careful when you hear things from even teachers that might lead to destruction. All right, so verse 22 through 26. And they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, "Do not even enter the village." So here we see Jesus heal another blind person, and he always does it in different ways, which I think is really interesting. But this is an instance where you can look at it and say, okay, he tried to heal the guy, but the guy wasn't fully healed, so then he had to finish it. Like, there were two stages to this healing. Did Jesus fail the first time? And I think the fact that this follows what he just talked to the disciples about gives us a clue as to why it happened this way. So if we go back just a little bit, in verse 18, he says to the disciples, "Having eyes do you not see, and having ears do you not hear?" So if we look at the blind man, Jesus puts his hands on him, and he sees a little bit, but he's still not seeing a clear picture. And I think that that is telling of what the disciples were experiencing spiritually. This man was seeing unclearly physically, but the disciples were still not seeing clearly. And then after that, Jesus heals him fully, and then he sees everything clearly. So I think that that is just showing what the disciples were also experiencing, and also the way that we can experience Christ, in that we might be healed slowly. I think people have different experiences with Christ. Some people have this like big boom, like Apostle Paul moment where he just appears to you. And then other people, it's more of a gradual process to understanding who Jesus is and what he did. And so I think there's a lot of lessons in there. But I think the fact that it happened right after this episode with the disciples gives us a little hint as to why it happened this way. There's just so many layers to it. It's beautiful. Okay, so verse 27 through 30. And Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they told him, "John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets." And he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Christ." And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him. So this is an important section here where he's asking the disciples, "Who do you say that I am? Like, you've been with me all this time. Who am I?" He wants to see, I mean, he knows what they think, but he wants them to think about who they think he is. And so Peter answers him, "You are the Christ." So he's saying, everyone else is saying you might be John the Baptist, you might be Elijah, or one of the prophets. And Peter is saying, but I know that you are the Christ, which is the Messiah. Christ is a Greek word. So he's saying you're the Messiah. And I'm going to share this really cool article down below in the description of this video. And it's from this website called gotquestions.org that I love as a resource, that you can ask pretty much any question and they've probably answered it on there in a biblical way. So it's a list of, not an exhaustive list, because it would take forever to make a list like that and there's always new connections, but it's a list of prophecies that Jesus fulfilled and where you can see him in the Old Testament. It's incredible. When I first clicked on it to read it, it was just going on and on and on. Like, it's this endless list. And so Jesus is the Messiah fulfilling these prophecies, and Peter knows it. So I think that's an important question for all of us to ask when Jesus says, "Who do you say that I am?" If Jesus was in front of you right now and he says, "Who do you say that I am?" that is the most important question you could ever answer. If you're unsure about who Jesus is, that is going to have eternal consequences. And if you're just blowing it off and not thinking about who Jesus was, even though we know he was this real historical person, it's unwise, because there are consequences to the way that you answer this question. And if you can't answer this question as you are the Christ, you are God in human flesh, come to save me, then there's some examination that needs to happen there, because either Jesus was who he says he was, or he was a raging lunatic. So it's important to examine who he is to you. Who is Jesus to you? That is the most important question that you need to answer in this lifetime. And you don't have forever, so I definitely recommend you do it soon. All right, so verse 31. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." So back in Isaiah, we see a prophecy of Jesus where he's going to have to suffer and be ridiculed, and everything he's saying here is going to happen as it was prophesied back in the book of Isaiah in the Old Testament. Why does Jesus have to suffer many things, like it says in verse 31? Because our sin is so great and our rebellion against God is so great, and he is perfectly just and good. Jesus has to pay an equal penalty to our sin. So when Jesus dies on the cross, he's taking on all of my sin, all of my shame, everything that I've done in rebellion against God, and he's putting it to death. So because of my sin and because of God's love, that's why Jesus has to suffer and die. So he's saying to his disciples, this is what's going to happen to me. And Peter, who loves him, he's wrong here, but he rebukes him. And he's saying, like, this is not going to happen. This cannot happen to you. You're wrong. He's saying this to Jesus. Meanwhile, he just told Jesus that he was the Messiah. So we know that Peter knows who he is, but his flesh and the enemy here are starting to get to him, and he's taking his eyes off Jesus and off eternity and putting them on worldly things. So Jesus, I love this part, he says, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." So Peter was being short-sighted here, and Jesus puts him in his place. Because the enemy wants to stop Jesus from fulfilling this plan, because it means that he's going to eventually be destroyed. But Jesus knows that this is what has to happen, and Peter here is not really on his team when he says this. So he's saying, you're not setting your mind on the things of God. You need to refocus on the correct perspective. All right, verse 34. And calling the crowd to him with his disciples, he said to them, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what can a man give in return for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." Whoa, this part, you might have heard this before. This is the end of chapter 8, but this is a super important part that we're going to dive into right now. So he's basically giving the disciples instructions on, if you're going to follow me, you need to take up your cross. What does that mean? I'm not wearing my cross right now, but I usually wear it, and I like to wear it as a reminder of what Jesus did for me. But back then, the cross was it was an instrument of execution. People didn't look at it and see this beautiful symbol. They saw horror and death. So when he's saying, take up your cross and follow me, he's saying you need to affirm that this is what has to happen. You cannot save yourself. You need to die to yourself. So he says, for whoever will save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. So here, I think he's giving that eternal perspective again. If you want to have a preserved life and put all your eggs in your earthly basket, you're losing sight of eternity, and you're going to lose your life eternally. If you want this eternal life, You need to take up your cross and follow me. Live in my way and spread the gospel. He says, whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. If you sacrifice and put to death your worldly desires, your flesh, and you follow me in my ways, you will save your life. And that is putting God's will before my own, because I can look at things in this world and say, like, I want this and that. I want to be great, and I want to have this status and this influence. But if we lose sight of God's will and being his instruments here on earth, we're gonna lose sight of the whole thing. That is the whole reason why I am here as a believer, is to spread the good news of the gospel and to be the hands and feet of Christ. So then in verse 36, this is one of my favorite verses. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? Would you rather have the temporary things of this world, even if you could have everything in this world, or eternity with God? And this reminds me of when Jesus was in the wilderness being tempted by Satan. Satan tried to tempt him by offering him all the kingdoms on earth, and Jesus wanted no part in that because he had his eye on eternity, which is what we need to do. And then in verse 38, he calls this generation this adulterous and sinful generation. And adultery is the way that God refers to the Israelites and his people as they continually rebel against him. They're choosing the world over God. They're rejecting God for the world, and that's why he calls it an adulterous generation. And he's saying, if you're ashamed of me, at the end, I'm also going to be ashamed of you. If you reject me, you will also be rejected. So this is all pointing to this really big and important choice that we all have to make in this life. Because I've said this before, but none of us are going to be here forever. I could walk down the street and get hit by a car. Something horrible could happen. You never know. So right now is all we're guaranteed, and this is the time to figure it out. If you're unsure where you stand with Jesus, you need to pray about it. Ask him to open your eyes. Ask him for clarity and wisdom. And I pray that he would give it to you. He says that if you ask in his name, you will receive. So ask with an open, softened heart. And man, there was a lot in that chapter, but I hope you guys enjoyed it. We're going to be doing Mark chapter 9 next, so you can go ahead and read it ahead of time and join me in the next video for Mark chapter 9. But for now, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you learned something. Leave me a comment below and let me know what you thought, and I'll see you in the next video. Stay blessed. Bye.